Okay, welcome back to what is episode 8 of Aginspire Conversations. Interesting conversations with people doing inspiring things in agriculture. And my next guest is somebody who I found very inspiring over the years and certainly leveraged off her technical expertise in veterinary medicine. It's Catherine McAloon, a lecturer in UCD, member of the herd health team, and a European specialist in bovine health management. How are you, Catherine?
Hello, Tommy. I'm good, thanks. And you?
I'm very good, and thanks very much for your time this morning. I know, like a lot of people I've asked to do this, you've kind of been, oh my God, what's Tommy asked me to do? And I've twisted your arm, and you're here to have a conversation with me.
No, it's my pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
Catherine, I suppose starting off, I really want to leverage off your technical expertise in a few areas that I've been sort of seeing over the summer in herds, because you're somebody I've gone back to time and time again to have discussions with. But I suppose with everybody that I've talked to so far, I've tried to have a bit of a conversation on how they got into agriculture. I know you're very passionate about farming. You're a County Fermanagh native. So tell people a little bit about your own journey into veterinary and probably your interest in farming as well. Does it stem from your own roots from being from a farmer? How did you get interested in becoming a vet?
I suppose it's a bit of a cliche. I certainly wanted to do it from I was very young. I guess I was completely obsessed with cattle from a young age, lambs, calves, you name it, I was stuck in it. We had a suckler farm at home, and I just loved every bit of being from that and being involved in it. And I suppose people sort of expect you to grow out of that, and I never did. It just became, stronger and stronger interest the older I got. I guess I wanted to be a farmer or a vet. I was just kind of immersed in that. I was lucky enough when I was about 16, I got a job in the local veterinary practice. Brian Ross and his family gave me a job there, and I'm very grateful to them because that kind of immersed me in the whole veterinary sphere, and I sort of knew, I had some idea about it, and then I was fortunate enough to get a place, so I felt very lucky and went ahead and did the degree. And I guess all of it really stemmed from this just love of cows, and it might sound silly, but that's kind of my driving factor. It still is to this day. I love working with them, being around them, the interest then in kind of farm systems, how they function, that sort of developed then over the years. And I loved my degree, loved every, small animal horses. But I guess farming was kind of always the real passion. And although I did mixed practice after I qualified for 3 years, and I enjoyed working with small animals and horses, and I enjoyed the mix, I enjoyed that, needed to get that out of my system. Yeah. And a lot of that motivation was, I really want to learn about cows, be able to treat sick cows, be able to calve cows, that was all part of it. As I suppose a couple of years went by, I was fortunate enough, I was working with great farmers. Them really probably the biggest inspiration to me in my career, in that they would ask me questions that I often couldn't answer. There was one herd in Tyrone I used to do regular scanning for, and it was always a running joke on a Thursday, what would they find to ask me next that I didn't know, and kind of relished that and wanted to find out more and more. I worked in a practice in RD in Louth as well, some great progressive farmers there, and they keep you on your toes, and I guess that when they started asking me questions about the kind of herd management and stuff, that kind of desire for knowledge and being able to help at a herd level kind of, I suppose, grew from there. I felt I didn't really have enough understanding to do that with my, I needed more training, and I had considered going back to the herd health cert, which I was really excited about. And although I love my job, this opportunity to do a residency kind of came up just at the right time. And Michael Doherty has so many great sayings, but one of them is that everything in life is about timing. Yeah. And that particular February that the residency was advertised, so I was hoping to start the Dairy Herd Health Cert that coming autumn, but the lady who was in the job, she left after a year. She went back to New Zealand, and it came up unexpectedly. So that was a big decision. Was I going to go and do a residency in UCD and go back to Dublin and leave a practice job that I loved to learn about kind of herd health, or would I wait and do the grad cert and continue my job? That kind of coincided with a shoulder injury, and anyway, in the space of a week I had applied for it, and I got it, and I think that the way the cards fell that year, I was just very lucky to get that opportunity. I didn't take the decision, I suppose, that lightly. It was a €30,000 pay cut, to put that into context, to go back to learn some more about herd health. And after 3 years, you're just finding your feet. And, I was at that stage where I was starting to have an interest in business and things like that. But I sort of knew I wasn't done learning, and I thought, well, it's now or never. So I took the opportunity, went back to UCD on a 4-year program. I did my ECHM residency in conjunction with a research degree supervised by Dr. Finbar Mulligan. I had Ingrid Lorenz and Owen Ryan as my supervisors for ECBHM. Owen being a great career mentor and sort of hero of mine, and someone who I aspired to become like, and then to be back working under him was great. And sure, the years flew past in there, and all of a sudden I had finished, and then I came to, and we've spoken many times about what to do after that. Yes. I have ended up staying there. Kind of one thing has led to another, and I'm still there, and have had a few roles now in the last couple of years between veterinary public health and herd health, farm animal medicine, which is sort of where I'm reasonably settled at the moment, and I suppose I'm lucky and grateful.
Very good. It's funny you mentioned Owen Ryan, and you meet so many veterinary students and young vets over the years, and he has certainly been a mentor since his time there in UCD for many of them, and it has inspired a lot of them. You can tell Owen that I'd be looking out to have a chat with him at some stage as well. One of the things that has been common with people I've spoken to, Catherine, is that curiosity and learning. I have it myself. It can come at a cost, as you said. You went back to academia to take a pay cut, which is a big thing to do. Learning, what drives you to want to learn more? What is it that drives you? Is it when you're asked that you don't know, or is it just generally in curiosity, you think?
I guess it started with that, being asked questions about herd management, and I was always very nosy, and it's something I think that has maybe stood me in good stead, and I encourage students, when you're out on farms as a practitioner, starting off, what are you feeding? What's the system? What's the genetics? Learn about all of that and just try and absorb as much as you possibly can from different systems. And I'd say farmers have taught me the most in my career, and still do. That desire to know more, I suppose, about the herd management was what took me back to UCD in the first place. And I was very naive in my thinking that I would learn a finite amount and then I would just know the answers. Yeah. I quickly learned that the more you know, the more you don't know, and that there's no actual end point in that journey, and that you're always learning, and that's okay. So I guess that desire for herd health was probably what took me there, and then kind of an ongoing curiosity into trying to find practical solutions to problems. And it's become it's a bit bittersweet when the more you get to know about kind of the literature and finding evidence base for things, and you realize that there's often not an evidence base for some things, but ultimately you have to still give some sort of informed opinion. But I came into UCD with kind of desire to do the clinical training within the ECBHM, and research was a necessary part of that. I would say I had little interest in it when I started, and that journey has really grown over the years, and I fully enjoy it, and I love the chance to try and ask a question and do a project that might be able to answer it, and that desire for learning. And I guess it kind of feeds on itself over the years, and I've kind of realized now that there'll be no end point, that it's just a continuous journey.
And that's a good thing. I think once you realise that, I would say, Catherine, as well, you're part of a couple. Your husband is also, Catherine McAloon, is involved in UCD, and he's a veterinarian as well, and very much interested in research. So I'm sure you bounce a lot of that research and those ideas and conversations off each other. Talk to me. I think you mentioned a really important thing there, and it's something that I've come to learn over a period of time, is the farm system. And as I think the vet of the future on farm is, typically James Herriot, that style of veterinary, calving the cow, treating the sick cow. But it is evolving, that we need to really, if we're going to be impactful on farm, understand the farm system. And that comes from the genetics, the production of the animals, and a base understanding of nutrition on animals, particularly in dairy farms and all systems, even sheep and beef as well, because a lot of the issues we see, manifestations of disease, come from underlying issues with production in the systems. Would I be fair to say about that? what's your take on, okay, a farming system? You're going out to look at a farming system. What are the key things as a young veterinarian or a farmer there that you want to, the key things from a production point of view that you want to measure or look at, the parameters that you really go to first when you're trying to understand where the system is?
I guess that's it's a really good point, and it's something that I sort of naively thought that when I would go to a herd health problem, there would be some sort of easy win, some sort of low-hanging fruit that this is milk fever and you feed this and that's a closed book and that's the end of that. Thankfully, I've learned that that's just not the way it works, and all problems are multifactorial, and often there's no real satisfactory conclusion. You change little things and everything feeds into ultimately the running of the farm. I guess there's things the question I would always encourage students to ask when we go to herd visits or that we ask ourselves is always, what is the system the farmer is trying to run, and to make sure that we interpret that correctly, and there are many different ways and different systems out there. Is it a very traditional grass-based system? Like, what is the annual average yield of a herd? And it's been interesting when I would have asked that question when I started doing my residency, people answered in litres. The last few years, people answer in kilos of milk solids, and it just reflects where we are. And so I guess, the actual production, what are they trying to achieve? Then you're into the cow type that gets you there. What is the cow type on the farm? Then we're into the things like, what's the calving pattern and the, the nutrition management and so on. And most of the herd health investigations are often around questioning and so many questions, but I think it's very important to understand what is normal for the farm before you can really understand what's gone, if there is, of course, an abnormality or something that isn't working.
Nutrition is absolutely key, though, isn't it? It really is. Like, I suppose, I've got to work with great nutritionists over the years. I've got an interest in nutrition now because I saw it time and time again. When I started digging and asking the questions, I realized that it was, inputs versus outputs weren't being matched up. Other factors like something that was affecting dry matter intake, be it, space in the house or weather conditions or anything like that. And rumen health is so important, isn't it?
Absolutely. Like I guess nutrition was one of the key things to herd health in the first place. One of the things that my love of cows comes from is a fascination with their rumen, like how it works. It continues to blow my mind. I feel I would never fully understand it. You keep learning new things, how they digest, how their physiology. And I remember being in like second year in college, and you're learning about anatomy and physiology, and you realize that if you're going to do farm animal, that's probably one of the most important lectures that you'll ever have. You didn't know that at the time, but as you go forward, I guess it all and so many things come down to nutrition and management. And then when I came back to UCD, I was really interested in that, and I ended up doing my research project with Lungworm Mulligan, and him and I started off on a quest to take rumen samples and look at rumen food and grass analysis, and we ended up on a slightly different track for a number of reasons. I ended up looking at a large data set to try and look for milk fat depression before I could ever go to the stage of going to the cow. So that took me on a different track, opened up different doors, but ultimately the love of nutrition was kind of how we started on that journey, and that's what my whole research degree kind of focused on. Nutrition meets epidemiology, but ultimately it's the driving factor for an awful lot of issues, and even in calves as well. Nutrition is really the be all and end all, and we're lucky in this country. We have some great people working in nutrition, and I always find the most successful herd visits are, where there's a nutritional problem, where all the relevant people are at the one table. It tends to, give you the best results. And I'm still learning from Dr. Lungworm Mulligan. I feel I always will be. I used to drive around in the car with him when we go to herd visits, and I'd just be having questions off him at the start, and I always, I'm surprised he didn't throw me out on the side of the road, but several years later, sort of 6-7 years, we're still asking still asking questions, and but nutrition is certainly one of my favorite areas to look at, and it just encompasses so much.
It's funny, Finbar gave a talk last year at CAVI at the Cattle Veterinary Conference, and it was one of the best talks I've heard in the last 3 years for a number of reasons. He really went outside the box, I think, a little bit about he talked about nutrition, but he talked on a bigger scale as well around where farming fits in, the environment, some of the work that was done in UCD. I thought it was tremendous, another great asset to the UCD team. Okay, Catherine, so let's get a little bit technical with you because you have all this information in your brain. Some of the areas that I've been seeing over the last couple of months and talking to farmers, there's a few of the common ones I said I'd ask you about today. And one that causes a lot of, I suppose, debate, and I've been heavily throwing my opinions around on it, is summer scour syndrome in calves, where we turn calves out to grass in their first grazing season, obviously, and you have this wasting where calves go back. To me, it always looked like lack of rumination, really scoury, get quite thin quite quickly, and I've come to the conclusion that it's acidosis, and that's what I talk about now. It seems to be becoming more and more common. Lots of farmers again talking about it this year, and I spoke to you a couple of weeks ago about it, and you were very I suppose clear on the science. Guys like me tend to go off on our own tangents, maybe make up stuff sometimes to suit our narrative, but you were very clear on the science on it from your perspective. So talk to me a little bit about what you think summer scour syndrome is, what are the factors that might be playing into it, and maybe how can farmers that have had an issue with it in the last couple of years maybe make changes?
I wish I knew the answer definitively, but I can give you my top and dirt anyway. I guess the first thing that we would try and do is try and rule out the common things: coccidiosis, worms, even things like molybdenosis, which is a completely different entity, and I don't think fits in with this sort of summer scour syndrome itself. Sort of very specific to some herds in the country, depending on their grass and soil type. And sort of when we've done the grass analysis, fresh forage analysis, ruled out the fecal egg counts and cocci, they're the kind of first diagnostics that we would do. And then we come into this sort of summer scour syndrome, where I guess the fact we call it a syndrome probably implies that we don't really know what's causing it. I guess the thing for me, I suppose, is it comes down to the kind of physiology and back to that piece on the rumen. If we think of a calf is the same as a baby, as a monogastric animal, and we call them pseudo-monogastrics until they're sort of 4 or 5 weeks of age, when there's a bit of rumen development going on, and a bit of substantial rumen development sort of from 4 to 5 weeks onward. And they're processed to handle a milk-only diet at a low pH. As they become older, then the rumen has to develop, and that needs some key things. So I guess the papillae and the wall of the rumen itself has to develop, which is driven by certain volatile fatty acids that they receive from starter, and the actual musculature of the rumen itself has to develop, and it needs to raise to a stable pH at which they can handle a forage-based diet, which is quite different from the calf as a pseudomonogastric at 4 or 5 weeks of age. Obviously the science that we do know around weaning is that a kilo of starter intake, consistently, or a kilo and a half for group fed calves and so on, probably means that the rumen is developed enough to be able to handle a non-milk diet. What we have no idea about is if we start replacing some of that concentrate with grass, for example, so milk-fed calves at grass, or often farms will find it difficult to get those calves to eat a kilo of concentrate, but they're eating grass, so does it matter? And I guess that for me, it all comes down to that piece around the functional ruminant, and a weaned animal on an absolute necessity that they need to be a functional ruminant and able to process a forage-based diet when milk is dropped out completely. And I think where we see issues, then for me, it's that rumen upset, dysbiosis, failure of functional ruminant, whatever you want to call it. Whether it's that they go out to lush grass and they're processing, a diet that precipitates an acidosis or an acid load in the rumen, or the developing rumen that they can't handle. Other theories, that's certainly one. Another is that they're on protein-rich grass, they're browsers, and they will take the top of the grass, the high nitrogen part, and particularly on reseeded pasture and so on, where they may particularly take in a very significant load of nitrogen, which has to be digested into products that in an adult ruminant, ammonia and things that will be cycled through the rumen may not be fully developed in a calf of that stage, and you're into almost like an ammonia toxicity. And you see things like ulcers and so on associated with that. But to be honest, we don't really know. There's not enough science behind it to say one way or another, and that's the honest truth of it. We've really no idea. I think it's probably academic, because we do know that it is a failure of a functional rumen, and whether it's acid or protein or whatever else is driving that, the endpoint is the same, that it's about trying to, go back to basics with the rumen development story. And 9 times out of 10, you put them in off grass and the problem goes away. And that's, so feeding management seems to be the one kind of key thing for me. There are lots of farms that feed calves milk at grass and do perfectly well and don't see this problem and wean their calves without any growth check. There are other farms that, wean the calf fully in the house and they go out onto certain grazing conditions, and then they still see it. So I think there's obviously a scale of problems within that. And for me, it's very much about that kind of rumen function, how we promote it. I certainly would be very interested in the research around where we start dropping out concentrate kilos and adding in grass, and what does sugary grass do for rumen development? Is it the same thing? In theory, we hope that it is, but are we sure? So I guess.
What about this high oil content in spring grass in particular? It could be up to about 17-18%. Are we right in that figure? The linoleic acids and those type of oils, are they that high in grass?
I suppose for milk fat depression, we'd probably be looking at up to 5% dry matter, but I guess it depends on the type of forage you're going into. I guess calves are probably hitting second rotation. Well, it depends on whether they're going to calf paddocks or not. That overwintered grass early on in the season, which they're probably not going to be exposed to, is more likely to be the stemmy, higher fibre stuff versus the young, rapidly growing lush grass that they will often be turned out to reasonably, strong covers and so on. So I guess it sort of depends. The oil content, again, like whether the rumen can process that is another factor. But ultimately, it's down to having a functional ruminant and a well-functioning rumen when they hit grass. And then the type of grass, I guess, might have to be altered for the farm. Certainly, we have advised some farms to go into stemmier grass or provide extra fibre, which they often won't eat at grass. They'll just waste it. So I guess there's unfortunately no silver bullet, because every farm seems to experience this quite differently. And some farms I've seen problems and they have no problem the next year, even though they don't do anything differently. So
it's a very confusing one, certainly. What my experience would be is what I've found to work, and you've sort of alluded to it there as well, is putting calves into stronger covers when they start grazing, but really focus back on weaning again, and particularly that last few calves that might be weaned a bit earlier and mightn't have that full rumen development. Those two things, and then sometimes you have to put in the rumen buffers as well to try and get them through it. But it's a really interesting one. And this time next year you'll have an answer for me, or next 2 years. There's the next project, Catherine.
Well, we'll see.
One of the areas that you've worked a lot on, and a lot of farmers certainly, and in fairness, a lot of people from not just Ireland watch these, New Zealand, Australia, and the New Zealanders will be very familiar with this pathogen, which is Mycoplasma. And you're sort of leading a lot of the research in this country around Mycoplasma bovis, and Mycoplasma, the pathogen, and how it affects our herds, from mastitis to lameness. Do you want to talk a little bit about Mycoplasma? Because I think you yourself and Connor went to New Zealand, if I'm right, and spoke a little bit about it. I just give, again, I love my own opinion, love the sound of my own voice, Catherine, but I think it's a significant pathogen in dairy farms, and my experience as well is it's actually a significant pathogen in weanlings in beef farms, particularly when you're buying in weanlings in stores for the winter. I've hearing a lot of reports of Mycoplasma pneumonia. So I suppose just give people a little bit of background on Mycoplasma in your research and where you think we need to go with it, and I might ask you a few more questions then.
I guess Mycoplasma is a bug that I am particularly fascinated by. I'm not sure I've done a whole lot on it. I'm hoping, I've just recently got some funding to do some work in Ireland on it. There's a prevalent study underwent. We're going to have a look at some strain variation in the next sort of 12 months, hopefully. But from a clinical point of view, I guess the job in UCD brings you to herd investigations, and that's kind of what inspired my interest originally. And we've been with Mycoplasma outbreaks, and I remember there was one herd in particular where a cow came into UCD and she had swollen fetlocks. And we did the usual approach to the one animal, we scanned the joint and we tapped it, and it was all, a one animal diagnosis. And when we took the history, as we always do with cow cases, are there any others affected? The farmer said, well, actually there's 6 or 7 more. And then all of a sudden your ears prick up and go, okay. And that was an interesting case. And I guess I was heavily involved with that outbreak. And then subsequently that kind of inspired an interest, and we've been to several outbreaks since. And Mycoplasma is a sort of high impact disease for a smaller number of farms, in that, you don't see outbreaks of it every day of the week. We have it in the country for a long time. It was diagnosed in a heifer imported from France in County Meath originally. And it is thought to be endemic here, as opposed to New Zealand, who were quite sure that they were free of it, and it became a new introduction for them. Whereas, we have it here at a reasonable level that we're not really sure of how much. So a recent bulk tank survey, this is just a point prevalence kind of snapshot in time, where we looked at the number of herds that had antibodies that were exposed. It was in around 40% of the sample of randomly selected bulk tanks had antibodies. So those herds had met it, had made some sort of immune response to it. I guess we certainly see issues in dairy herds. So we see explosive issues on some farms where they get what we think is a new outbreak. And that ranges from high, morbidity of lots of cows with swollen joints, plus or minus mastitis. Can present as pneumonia, even in adult cows. Sometimes I've seen that as the sort of index case on farms, and then the next thing, cows start hitting the parlour with mastitis rapidly progressing to 4 quarters on the joint issue. And then, of course, on other farms, we see completely random cases. They seem to have they know they're Mycoplasma infected, and every year they get 1 or 2 cases where, an animal dies with Mycoplasma, whether or lung issue, but it floats along under the surface. And then, of course, there is within the beef herd, and I would agree, there's lots of issues, and even in feedlots, Mycoplasma would be one of the leading pathogens in the BRD complex, respiratory disease here. So across all farm systems, it's a problem. I guess I'm uniquely fascinated by its, it has some really impressive pathogen features in how it can avoid the immune system and how it can persist and so on. And I guess the complicating factor is that it can also live very happily in cows' noses and tonsils and actually not do them a bit harm. And that commensal nature of it makes it diagnosis very difficult. So it's certainly a pathogen I'm interested in. So I see a biased sample set in herds that I sort of seek out in terms of outbreak investigation, and that's something that we're very interested in UCD. But I guess for the vast majority of herds, and from that bulk tank survey, you would suggest that there's probably a lot more antibodies and maybe exposed animals than there is infection or outbreaks of infection. Thankfully, they're not as common as the sort of the more endemic version of it.
Why do we not have a licensed vaccine for Mycoplasma? I know there's one available, but why? And I suppose that's a question that comes up with a lot of pathogens. Sometimes is a farmer might go online and they'll Google the diagnosis that they might have on farm. They'll see there's a vaccine, and we don't have that here. And Mycoplasma, there's a vaccine in America. Why wouldn't we have that here? Is it to licensing, or can you get a Mycoplasma vaccine made up? Have you any experience of that, Catherine?
Yes, so the vaccine has been a very, I guess, variable in terms of its efficacy, and even in countries where it is used, it still has very variable success rate. So when I worked in Northern Ireland, I was familiar with a few herds that had outbreaks of it, and they had sent, a sample of joint fluid or mastitic milk away, and they'd cultured the exact strain they had on the farm, and it's a vaccine that's made up specific to that farm. I find limited the vaccine in the north would be that there was one herd where it made things 10 times worse, explosive, and so I guess there certainly is very variable responses to it. we're nowhere near where we need to be in terms of research with it. One of the impressive features is this kind of variable surface proteins where it can kind of mimic and change, and it's very difficult to make an immune response that will target that. They've been very successful with Mycoplasma vaccines in pigs and poultry against some similar pathogens, and I guess you're into sort of specific how you stimulate the immune system and how different types of immunity into what works and what doesn't for Mycoplasma. And there's a guy that leads that in the University of Melbourne, and there's lots of work going on in Mycoplasma vaccination, but we're not quite there yet in terms of a efficacious vaccine that will work repeatedly in all cases. So unfortunately, it's not in our armory just yet.
It's interesting. We're all learning about vaccines. I suppose we have familiarity with the complexity that a vaccine is and how efficacious and how well it works, essentially. And I think they're very valuable tools. But again, if husbandry and management is under pressure, no vaccine is a silver bullet. Sure, it's not, Catherine.
No, and I've just had my brother on the phone earlier on, and he said, and we're very close, and I think you met him back in Enniskillen when my love of suckler farming became clear. He was asking about, I forgot to do my pre-weaning vaccine, can I vaccinate on the day of weaning? And that's a very common question. I was like, no, absolutely not. You're not going to get the response out of it. That's a waste of money, and that's a common thing we come across. And I guess that's vaccines are brilliant, but we must know what their limitations are. We must, that no vaccine will hold up in the presence of, huge other immune challenges, or whether that's stocking rate or husbandry or whatever else it is that's driving a problem. So although I think vaccines are brilliant and they're often a first line in herd problems, they certainly aren't there in isolation.
Certainly for the beef farmers, and we're coming into that season where weaning is going to be front and centre. Now is the time. Like your brother, you shouldn't let him slip so far, Catherine. You'll have to give out to him. But now is the time to be thinking about vaccinating weanlings. If you're weaning in September time, October time even, now is the time to consider stimulating that immune system, isn't it, if you're a beef farmer? And I think really they're one time you use vaccines from a respiratory perspective that you can really get bang for your buck as well.
Absolutely. So we'll delay to make sure that it's in a logistical change for, depending on, it's not as handy as it would be to do them today, but that's the way it'll have to be. So this time of year, and hugely important. And like many things in herd health, vaccines are one thing that maybe the only thing we have, but we have to get the best out of them. So,
Catherine, one other clinical condition that comes up year after year, and I've again discussed it with you at length in the past, is coughing cows. And again, it's back to respiratory disease in particularly adult dairy cows. I've seen a little bit of in suckler farms as well, but adult dairy cows, coughing cows would always bring lungworm to mind at this time of year. A lot of epirinomethin been used on dairy farms repeatedly to control these problems. They're not always lungworm. They can be complicated. They can open the door for other respiratory diseases. I suppose some of your opinions on the coughing cow complex, and that's a very hard one. You could spend hours talking about it, I know, but maybe give some of your insights and from experiences. Have you seen it this summer again, the coughing cow syndrome? Have you been investigating any cases?
We have, yeah. I guess it's one of those things where you could open Pandora's box when you start going on pathogens around coughing cows, and certainly in our experience, probably the predominant problem is coughing cows at grass, and generally parasites, lungworm is generally front and centre with that story. Not always. There are certain exceptions, and maybe although lungworm may have caused an initial insult, there can be other things involved. But ultimately, I guess lungworm is probably the most common thing that we would be dealing with in terms of those particularly coughing at grass. Certainly, we've come across a number of kind of risk factors that tend to be driving problems, and it seems to be the same across the board. Like when I went through college not that long ago, worming adult cows was not a thing, and that's become a new phenomenon in the last few years. Things that we see, I suppose, repeated are this idea of the development of immunity to lungworm in the young stock, and that can be certain, maybe contract rearing where animals leave the farm, are reared under different conditions, or maybe very well dosed. That can happen, of course, on the home farm as well. And they just don't get the sufficient opportunity to develop an immunity that will last. So then we're into a scenario where often we have actually naive first calving heifers hitting grass, and then they very often ramp up the challenge, the pasture burden, seed it very heavily, and then you're into the reinfection syndrome in older cows. That's probably the most common thing we come across. Other things that will drive that in turn are temperate climate, grazing conditions, stocking rate, will all have a role in that as well on farms. It's not only the immunity of the young stock piece, but the grazing conditions on how we go about grazing, rotational grazing and so on, can be potentially feeding into that as well.
I'm probably biased now because I'm involved in a project around lungworm vaccination, because I think for a long time I think it's one of our oldest vaccines. But I think it has a real role to play, particularly if we're going to look towards sustainable parasite control. And I've seen it just work so beautifully on some farms. It's not without its challenges. What's your own opinion on lungworm vaccine, Catherine? Is it something we need to be having a discussion about, certainly on some of these farms who are using 3 and 4? I met a farmer, several farmers who used 4 and 5 doses of epidemectin on their milking cow herd last year. What's your opinion on lungworm vaccine?
I guess I'm a big fan. I am, and traditionally the argument against was that its purpose was originally for first grazing season calves, and it didn't suit a springborn calf if the dose had to be completed before turnout and so on. But I think we're in a different scenario now. Things have, and I guess where we tend to recommend it is often for that group of first calving heifers. So a spring calved heifer, she's done in mid-December and mid-January, and that seems to be kind of the first sort of line where we will look to use it. We have occasionally recommended to use it across whole herds in real, and one of those I was involved with you with back a few years ago, where they were on a serious problem, and I guess those are not that common, but certainly, and probably has a role even in young stock, even in the first grazing season can be introduced. And once you have a relatively robust immunity developed, when those animals then hit the adult herd going to the grazing platform, you also have a bit of a safety belt. But once you're into trouble because of how we graze our cows, it's very difficult to get back out. I find, in a year where you're and that's often why they end up using epidemectin multiple times and so on. So I think strategic use of huskvac could really be really useful going forward, and something we certainly recommend often in those herds.
Okay, Catherine, I feel like I'm giving you like almost an oral exam of hitting you with technical stuff, but I suppose there's some really top tips and some key issues that are going to be affecting farms at the moment. But if you're also, and we've had conversations around, so that's the micro stuff happening on farm, but maybe the macro stuff that we're going to be facing challenges with, antibiotic production. Are we at the races, or do we really need to up our game when it comes to where we are around antibiotic usage in maybe cattle and sheep systems at the moment? Because new regulations are just around the corner, a year and a half away. Obviously, with the COVID challenge, those conversations have been probably put on the back burner, but they're going to come again for farmers. Do you think we're well prepared for the challenge of reducing antibiotics that we have to do, or do we need to do more work?
I think we have, we have a brilliant agricultural industry in Ireland across the board, some of the best beef produced in the world, milk, and we do a lot of things very well, and we need to be very careful that we promote that equally well, that we protect it in terms of when those questions are asked around antimicrobial usage and so on, that we're able to answer those robustly. On the international stage, I suppose, and I guess I have a personal interest in this, involved with CellCheck, and I'm at the moment doing a little bit of work on intramammary antimicrobial usage. And I guess the main thing for me is that we're certainly not at the races in terms of recording at a national level. So, we don't have the same level of data that, farm level usage or prescriber level, very difficult to get accurate records on. It's been the bane of my existence for the last few months trying to get that. Actually had to withdraw a paper from publication because of issues, trying to access data. And I think that's the first thing. Because it's difficult, if we don't measure it, it's very difficult then for it to be used for a robust comparison in terms of, internationally and so on. And part of that EU legislation, not only around reducing preventative antibiotics, but it's also around harmonizing like pharmacovigilance and recording of antibiotics at national level and across all sectors. So, the Irish industry has made DAFM has made huge progress in the pig industry, recording antimicrobial usage in the last couple of years. But that's something that will have to be replicated across all sectors, dairy, beef and sheep. And although they're probably the least offenders in terms of antimicrobial usage on a national picture, ultimately have a seat at the table in terms of reducing it and, things like selective dry cow therapy and so on. There's a tough few years ahead. I think measuring and recording is probably, system that's a huge, we need to know where we are to know where we're going, I suppose. I think that's probably the first point in terms of usage. And yes, there's a few difficult things that we will have to, in terms of industry level address, because the horse has sort of bolted in terms of that legislation is passed, and the DAFM have an unenviable task in terms of how they will enact it, police it, or so on over the next few years of lead-in time. And I think it would be distraction to, ways of we need to slow it, or we're not ready. We're never going to be ready, I guess, what industry is. But, we've many brilliant things going for our agricultural industry and, a passion for agriculture. We've some, great system, Chagas, AHI, those kind of systems that are in place. Great dairy advisors, that are all equipped to lead the charge in terms of addressing those challenges.
It is coming, I think, and I know farmers get irate with me and a little bit annoyed with me, like I'm almost bringing the legislation in when I bring up this topic of AMR, but it's going to influence their businesses heavily. It's a really important area that we can get on top of, but I think we've some significant work to do in the next year and a half on it. I was involved, I know you're very busy because you're preparing for lectures for next year and everything like that, but I was involved with a very interesting discussion with you probably a year and a half ago at a conference, and it was around, we were doing different presentations, but the end of the day, the conversation focused on welfare, and it was to a veterinary audience. And it's an interesting topic when you mention animal welfare. It can be very emotive. People can feel like you're challenging your system. People can feel like you're getting very fluffy, and then people on another side can say, we don't care about welfare at all. We're not good enough. And animal welfare in the future is going to be a big driver for the way our farm systems work. I think we're doing a good job for the most part on welfare. I think good welfare and good farming should go together. To me, it's kind of almost common sense, but it's going to be a big challenge. Are we able to have that conversation around animal welfare as vets, as an industry, or do we all get a little bit uncomfortable about it? I do get that sense when you mention animal welfare, everyone gets a little bit uncomfortable. And my own opinion is we need to take control back of that story. What's your opinion on animal welfare? I know we've had our own discussions about it, and there was a really interesting debate that particular day around it. Because it's going to be another macro driver for our industry.
I guess my opinion is, again, similar to that in that it is very emotive and it's hard to have a rational conversation depending on who your stakeholders are in that conversation, because people look at animal welfare, metrics, whether you're a behaviourist or a vet or whatever, you can look at that differently. Certainly animal welfare across the board, I think it's a fundamental pillar in the sustainability piece. Animal health and welfare go hand in hand, and that's, a leg on which sustainability stands. I think as an industry, we do a really good job, and that's something that we need to protect and promote. In terms of welfare, I suppose from my point of view, a bit like the AMR piece, we need to be very careful how we measure, and we need to actually measure and make sure that we have robust measurements and performance indicators so that we know how we're doing, and we do in many across many sectors. But that probably needs a holistic approach, because it's not just calf welfare, but also cows, lameness, transition cow disease, SCC, are all welfare metrics, and I think all of those need to be in the kind of farm welfare piece, because and the metrics around it have to be robust to be comparable and to stand up on their own. And I do think we do a good job, and we need to continue that and continue always to look for marginal gains and measure, monitor, and improve, I guess.
Catherine, I'm going to leave you this question. Farm animal veterinary started something maybe that's been in decline over the last couple of years, maybe not as many farm animal vets qualifying, but I think that's possibly changing. I'm not sure, get your opinion, but I think it's, I spoke at a veterinary conference, an online one recently, and I said agriculture is going to be the most exciting industry over the next number of decades, and vets have a real opportunity to be, certainly with some of the challenges around antimicrobial resistance, welfare, and even the environmental challenges and longevity. How do we attract more people into large animal veterinary? Do you think it's contracting? It's going to stay the same? Is it not? Have we lost the excitement of James Herriot now? Is it about data? Is it about big herds? Is it about 4-hour visits as opposed to the somewhat what might seem exciting stuff? And I'm not saying that's going to go forever, but what's the future like because you're training the future farm animal vets, and I know you're passionate about that. What's the future like for farm animal medicine? Is it good, bad, or is it going to be the same?
Right, the future is bright. I guess all of those things are true. Wherever there's cows and beef and sheep, there's always going to be animals and sick animals that need to be treated, and that's the thrill of calving cows and treating the sick cow and sick calves that respond will always be there, and there will always be a need for vets to deliver that service, and that's a wonderful job and a privilege to be able to do. I think, though, within that, there's also the need for a skill set that approaches things on a preventative basis. We're looking at a very different spectrum going forward, in the face of welfare challenges and, a need and an absolute necessity to promote preventative medicine, because that's, how we become more sustainable and so on, and reduce antibiotics. So against all of that backdrop, although it will be challenging, I think we need to be qualifying vets that are capable of both, that are, able to respond to those clinical scenarios. The need for service will always be there, but equally well that are adaptable and have the skills to address the herd level problems and be able to provide an actual, value added service. And there's so many vets doing that already, and it is a change in space. And it's a privilege to be involved in education, and we see some really enthusiastic graduates going through each year. My personal passion is to try and instill that positivity around herd health and approaching it and kind of grabbing that nettle and getting stuck in and making a difference. So I think the future is bright. Agriculture is exciting to be involved in. Farm animal veterinary at any level is a lovely job. So I think bright and with challenging and cautious optimism.
Well, look, I think that's a great way to finish up. I think I would agree with you. And it's funny when you get past that threshold, because I think for me with the farm animal investigations, I wasn't winging it. I won't say I was winging it, but I didn't know enough until I got to a point past a threshold that I was comfortable. And when you go past that, and then you start walking into cows and you start seeing things, and you can use the diagnostics and all the other stuff to support it, it can be a wonderful transition, because you're really part of the farm team then in a lot of those relationships. You're really impacting profitability, animal health, animal welfare. So it's a very exciting space for young vets to get into. Listen, I just leverage off smart people like you and the research that you're doing, Catherine, and continued success doing the research you're doing. I'll obviously be keeping in touch with you. I suppose that's it. And thanks for your time. You've given so much technical information there. And it's good to meet someone who loves cows so much. Would you ever go back to farming yourself, Catherine? Is that something that's in the pipeline long term? Would you like to have your own stock and farm again?
Absolutely, it's a dream. I'm afraid the prime demand for farming in County Meath is a bit prohibitive at the moment, but that would always be the dream. If I won the lotto, I'd possibly I'd take up full-time farming tomorrow, but maybe someday, you never know. Thanks very much.
Would you go beef farming or dairy farm, Catherine?
I don't know. It depends on the land, on the scenario. I guess I'd never give up on my suckler roots, and suckler herd health is something I'm actually quite passionate about as well. So depending on the land type, I suppose what I could support.
Very good. Listen, continued success, Catherine. Thank you so much for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure, and thank you, and keep up the great work.
Thanks a million, Tommy. Great to be here, and you keep up the inspiring work as always too. All the best.